But the issue of Tibet has been an issue that has been kind of a framing point of reference for my journalistic career for about 20 years. As a university student, I traveled to Dharamsala, Makhalganj, where I became connected to and associated with the Tibetan issue, living with and speaking with and becoming very familiar with the situation that Tibetans are dealing with around the world. During those early years of my kind of connection with the Tibetan issue, the idea of this eternal optimism that this solution, that there was a solution that could be found and a return to Tibet was possible, seemed to be infectious. Hollywood movies and British celebrities, people around the world kind of were embracing the cause. And as a college student, that was quite powerful, so I kind of endorsed that idea. That there would be a solution and a salvation to the decades-long struggle. That view has shifted over the years, and as China has gotten stronger, that sense of personal optimism has diminished slightly, but Tibetans' optimism hasn't really diminished at all. It's changed and it's morphed, and in some ways, within the community, it's fractured, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about. So what I noticed as this rise in China's power was starting to shift the Chinese narrative. In 2008, something pretty important happened, or two things actually. The Beijing Olympics, which were kind of this coming out party for China's foreign policy, and the global financial crisis. As countries around the world were starting to kind of diminish in prominence, China was rising. And for China, what that meant is that they could take their view, their narrative towards foreign policy and issues that they found to be relevant, important, quote-unquote, core interests, and really pursue those interests outside the borders of China. And that's what this study and my book is about, how China's foreign policy changed in the post-2000 era to really go after the Tibetan exile community. So in 2008, the top Communist Party official in Tibet at the time, his name was Jiang Qingli, said while the torch from the Olympics was passing through the Tibetan plateau, he said, quote, and this is just to give you a frame of reference as to what this soft power war that I document, where it's emanating from. He said, Tibet's sky will never change and the red flag with 5 stars will forever flutter high above it. China will certainly be able to totally smash the splittest schemes of the Dalai Lama clique, and this smashing, he said, would occur inside and outside the country. And it was the outside of the country that I was most interested in kind of tracking down. A little bit of background really quickly. I know we're in a bookstore that tends to focus on the religious and the spiritual. My interest in the Tibetan issue began that way. As I kind of write in the book, I was raised Roman Catholic, and I had many challenges trying to figure out what that meant to me personally. And in Buddhism, I found something that in many ways, with a lot of practice and a lot of study, developed or at least hinted at some answers. So I think I was attracted to Buddhism for that reason. And that's why I was attracted to the Tibetan issue. But the more I spent with the Tibetans, the more their political story just kind of captured me. And the stories of repression and challenge and exile that every Tibetan family has experienced is what kind of lured me into that story. So when China declared war, soft power, hard power, however you want to define it, in 2008, what did that mean? So what it meant was that China, for all intents and purposes, focused its attention on making the Dalai Lama seem irrelevant. That seems kind of crazy, but their strategy was to make him look like a problem, to be hated by Chinese and, if possible, by Tibetans, and to get nothing for his efforts. So all of the efforts, all of the work that he tried to do to promote dialogue and peace and some sort of reconciliation with China to allow for the Tibetan situation to be solved, the Chinese were trying to delegitimize him in the eyes of the world. And they still do that. That's still very much their strategy. But they become much more powerful in how they do it. They use economic power to challenge and pressure countries that do not share the Chinese narrative on Tibet. They use propaganda to challenge and to pressure. They use good old-fashioned spycraft In 2009, when I was doing early reporting on the book, a Western government official told me that the Chinese had more spies in India spying on the Tibetans than the Russians had in the US during the height of the Cold War. So spying on Tibetan activity in exile was a very important tactic to the Chinese strategy. What are the Tibetans doing? What are their plans? And all of this kind of paints the picture of Tibetans as being a threat to the Chinese state, which, if you think about the fact that there's only 100,000 Tibetans in India and 150,000 Tibetans around the world, seems kind of an outsized threat to a country that's 1.4 billion people. But the Chinese Communist Party has always looked at counter-narratives as a threat to their own legitimacy. So the Tibetans became a focus of that attention. Religious manipulation is another tactic. The Chinese use things like splinter sects, sects that Tibetans have some disagreement with, and there's one sect called the Shugden sect. It's been alleged that China supports this splinter sect at the cost of alienating the Dalai Lama even further. The Chinese even, and this is probably well known to everyone who follows this issue, also require that reincarnated lamas, tulkus, are approved by the Chinese Communist Party. It's a tactic. We could go into it in the questions and answers if you'd like. But essentially, what this does is it gives the Chinese government a level of control over how the progression of Tibetan Buddhism will play out in the years ahead. This is changing slightly, I think, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, because in the past there's always been this accommodation with religion in China. The Chinese saw that religion was somewhat important to individuals, and you needed religion in many ways to allow society to function. I don't know if Xi Jinping takes the same view. It seems like it's becoming a bit less accommodating and a bit more hard-nosed elimination of religion. We're seeing it in Xinjiang with the Muslim issue and the allegations of up to 1 million Uyghurs being detained. But this idea of accommodation and what allowed the reincarnation puzzle to play out seems to be diminishing a little bit in Chinese interests. And then the last tactic that I think is really important is the Chinese practice what I would call strategic silence. The Tibetans have always advocated for talks. We want to solve the Tibetan puzzle, the Tibetan challenge, the Tibetan question, and the Tibetans want to sit down and talk about it. And the Chinese essentially just do nothing and say nothing and do not agree to talk. So the strategic silence for China is incredibly effective now because what has happened over the course of the last decade, people are starting to kind of self-censor their own actions. You see it, even here in the UK. Theater groups will not hold or perform Tibetan plays that are seen as potentially challenging to the Chinese narrative on Tibet. And they're pulling these things preemptively. They're making decisions that they believe might potentially anger China, so people are taking preemptive action. So the strategic silence is forcing change within kind of the international community's response to the Tibet issue. And in some ways, I might argue that strategic silence is the most effective policy that China uses at the moment. For Tibetans, what this means is an incredible amount of frustration within Tibetan communities and Tibetan societies. Over the course of reporting the book, one of the focal points of the book is this family that I spent a lot of time with. And in that family, you can see these divisions and differing views on what the future holds for the Tibetan issue. The old patriarch of the family is resolute and adamant that a return to Tibet will happen in his lifetime. He's 84, the same age as the Dalai Lama. His oldest son shares this view and doesn't take citizenship in India as younger Tibetans are entitled, because he too believes that a return to Tibet is happening. Whereas the youngest daughter has kind of given up and has moved abroad. She now lives in France. And I say given up, not necessarily on the Tibetan issue or Tibetan cause, but on the narrative of return. And she's exploring her own options. Others within the community have turned to substance abuse as a coping mechanism to deal with this level of frustration. So what I've tried to do in the book is talk about all of the broader issues that surround China's approach to the Tibetan challenge, but tell the story of the effects of that approach through the eyes of the Tibetans who I know and spent many years getting. And I want to read this not because, in my view, he captures the entirety of the Tibetan story, but he does capture the incredible uncertainty and anger and frustration that Tibetans feel toward their situation. And I don't have a picture of him to show you. When I do this in front of universities or other groups, I show a picture. But his name is Pasang, and he has very long black hair, but he's dressed in monk's robes. And if anyone knows how Tibetan Buddhism works, you're not supposed to have long hair if you're a monk. You shave it off. But he has kind of been in and out of exploring and using Tibetan Buddhism as a way to understand the Tibetan situation. He's a former military soldier in the Indian Army who went back to Buddhism as a way to kind of calm the anger. So I'm just going to read this, and then we can jump into questions, because I think that might be engaging, hopefully. So when I met Pasang in his meditation cave in the cliffs high above the Dalai Lama's house in northern India, he'd been meditating on and off for about 9 years. He's not a monk, more like a mystic. And he invited me into his unheated rock outcrop for a chat. For over an hour we sat on the dirt floor of Pasang's meditation retreat, sipping tea and discussing anger, forgiveness, and Pasang's continual frustration with his people's fate. He, not I, brought up the subject of China, and he thumbed prayer beads as he spoke in low, hushed tones. Smoke from a small incense burner hung in front of his face as he explained what brought him to a rocky outcrop high above the Dalai Lama's residence. As a boy, Pasang was patriotic but directionless, spending his days idle in his mother's convenience store in South India. When he turned 16, he followed in the footsteps of his father and volunteered to fight for the all-Tibetan military units within the Indian Army, called the Special Frontier Force. The need for a full-time job drove him to enlist, but anger secretly fueled him. He hoped the military would give him the chance to cross the Indian border into China and turn his patriotism into flying lead, to fight the Chinese and take my country back, he told me. But after 5 years of training and not a single bullet fired from his rifle, he traded in his guns for prayer beads, believing that the mind was a more powerful weapon in this war. Committed Buddhists believe that mastering the mind is the best way to bring peace to their own hearts and to the world. That, at least, was the goal for Pasang. But the more he and I spoke, the more I got the sense that this would be his final attempt to find peace within, before abandoning his practice altogether, or even resorting to more desperate measures. Part of what made him angry, he said, was how obstinate China was, despite Tibetans' repeated offers of compromise. Beijing's blessings, he said, were a source of great consternation. Pasang's soul-searching was not going well in the day we met. Tibetans are angry, he said, furious in fact. His mind was racing with rage. It's natural to be angry when somebody forcefully takes your country and occupies it, and even does harm to the people, he said. It's natural that everyone will feel angry. Tossing his long locks of black hair over his shoulder, he went on, I'm not totally devoted to Buddhism. War? I'm ready to go to war. Not totally decided Buddha disciple. This freedom. I really want freedom. Then, he added, younger generation of Tibetan people, we all want war. I leave the talk before the questions with that kind of glaring example of a Tibetan that I met, who I would argue is in the minority with those really strong feelings. The Tibetans are very unified on the nonviolence message that the Dalai Lama has shared, but after the Dalai Lama is gone, it's these types of sentiments that I personally worry about bubbling to the surface. What will Tibetans do when that glue that has really kept them nonviolent over the last 60 years is gone? And it's the question that Pasang is dealing with and has been dealing with for a decade, meditating. It's interesting that you say that. It's interesting that you ask that, because when I first started the reporting project, one of the books that kind of really inspired me was written by a former McClatchy Beijing bureau chief by the name of Tim Johnson. It's called Tragedy in Crimson. And it was a journey that he spent over a number of years following the Dalai Lama around. And I met Mr. Johnson in New York as he was reporting the book, and I asked him that very question, because this was in 2010 or 11, I think, when I met him, asking, should I be worried? And he said, well, my publisher's been threatened, my computer's, caught on fire, and, all of these things. I didn't experience any of that. No questions from my publisher, no suggestion that the book might not go to print. And the only thing that I can think is that from the Chinese perspective, the very fact that we're talking about this and suggesting that this Chinese strategy has been successful, I think is probably, from the Chinese perspective, maybe a message they'd like to be shared. It goes to this self-censorship thing that I talked about before. The Chinese are incredibly powerful economically, and countries are making decisions without even really being told anymore. I think when businesses go into deals with China, they know what's going to upset their business partners across the table, and so they're changing their policies and practices even before they sit down. So to answer your question, no, but unfortunately no. I mean, I'm not going to say I wish I was, but I think there's probably a good reason why I haven't been. It's a very good question. I think the end goal. So the challenge has always been that religion in China, in Tibet, has been politicized. That there's this connection between nationhood and religious identity, and the Dalai Lama has been this kind of focal point for Tibetans inside China, and anything that is suggestive of an alternate power that is not the Communist Party is a threat. So if after the 14th Dalai Lama passes and the 15th Dalai Lama, and you can almost guarantee that the Chinese will recognize their own reincarnation of a 15th Dalai Lama, and will probably either have only the Chinese version or a competing 15th. If that person is subservient to the Chinese narrative, that might appease the party's kind of Tibet policy, because they've accomplished the goal of not having an alternate threat or an alternate support of power, that challenges the Communist Party's power. But that's kind of more of the kind of the political side of things. I mean, the Chinese, at least from my perspective, in the current state, are never going to abandon the Tibetan plateau for all of the reasons that you just said: resources, strategic power, strategic location. It gives access to all of the countries in the proximity. So that's just simply not going to happen as long as the Communist Party is in power, from my perspective. But does that answer? Yeah. No, I think in some ways you're right. It's hard in a very short period of time like this to really give you an overview of what I've written, but I'm incredibly sympathetic to that point. The Tibetans have been for 60 years been very consistent, right? Exactly. I mean, the passages that I read at the end of Pasang's frustration is really the projection that I see kind of down the road. But over the 60 years that the Tibetans have been in exile, not only have they really honed to the nonviolent approach that the Dalai Lama has advocated, they've also shared Tibetan Buddhism with the world, and that's a gift that many of us have been able to experience. And Tibetans inside Tibet and in exile should be very proud of that accomplishment, and they are. In terms of answering the prayers, I mean, I look at it from a very kind of political and policy point of view, and that's not the only way people look at this issue, obviously. But from my perspective, from a geopolitical standpoint, the Tibetans have been they've been let down by governments around the world, but they've also in some ways been let down by themselves. I didn't talk too much about it, but this question for me, at least in India, of Tibetan citizenship, of Indian citizenship for Tibetans, is an incredibly important issue, I think, that needs to be raised. Tibetans who have been born after 1989 in India are technically entitled to citizenship, and many of them get this, but the government, the Tibetan exile government, does not advocate for this. Because they seem to think that it would somehow erode this narrative of displaced people waiting to return, that if they were to take citizenship in a different country, being India. It's not necessarily a case for Tibetans who live here or live in the United States and elsewhere. But the question of citizenship is one that I think that the Tibetan exile government should really be tackling and taking on as something that Tibetans should do. And that's what I mean, that I feel like in some ways Tibetans have been let down by their own administration to prepare for the post 14th Dalai Lama period. But there's no question that that certain governments have kind of turned their back on the Tibetan issue. My government still holds the Tibetan issue as important. Issues like reciprocity for access to Tibet. Some important legislation has recently been passed by the U.S. House and some support in the Senate. No idea what's going to happen now that we've had a recent election. My guess is hopefully that it will continue to be a strong support. But these are still kind of little pieces and picking at the broader issue instead of really pushing China and making them pay for their policies. So I share your frustration and disappointment. It's a really hard one for me to answer because I very quickly turned all of my conversations to this political question. But I think if the person that drew me into this issue from the very beginning was the old man that I lived with in 1997, named Purang Dorje. And for years I only knew him as Pala. He was an old gentleman who left Tibet a year or so after the Dalai Lama left, and moved to India and made a life for himself and raised a family. Every morning Pala would wake up in the 90s, and he's still alive and he's still doing it, and he would circumambulate the Dalai Lama's temple 2 times. And it would take him a couple hours. It's a couple kilometer walk. And it was just an ingrained piece of his dislocation that here was the center of gravity for him, that he was physically in very close proximity to. And it was what this man represented, what the Dalai Lama represented to the Tibetan people, to the cause, but ideally to the return, that was incredibly powerful to me. And obviously to Pala, that spiritual connection. When the Dalai Lama has tried to break the political piece from the religious piece. He gave up his political responsibilities a couple of years ago, and has tried to transition the Tibetan people to more of a democratic form of organization, to allow for things to be viewed in political and religious contexts. But Tibetans have a really hard time, I think, breaking making that separation, because it just it never existed in Tibet that way. And so in exile, this concept of democracy is very new. And so it's difficult to separate the two. And that kind of the circling every day of this person and his focus of his spiritual, religious, and political attention, for me, kind of brought the whole story together. And as powerful and as amazing that is, it's also potentially a liability for the post-Dalai Lama period. Yeah, I mean, I could speak about it from the perspective in exile, but I think also the question of what that was all about for Tibetans inside of Tibet is really important, because there's kind of conflicting narratives. For Tibetans in exile, this was a moment, in some ways, to stand up and kind of again proclaim to the world that the prayers of the Tibetan people haven't been answered. Look how desperate they are. But I think it might have been misinterpreted that this was kind of a call for external help from the immolators. I don't think that that's what the research or the kind of the the analysis suggests. Inside of Tibet, this was really about them taking control of their narrative inside of Tibet. And that is another kind of friction and split between the exiles and Tibetans inside of Tibet. Who speaks for whom? And after 60 years of exile, do the Tibetans in exile really speak for the Tibetans inside of Tibet? Do they need them to? So this is kind of the way that I viewed the question. There's a chapter in the book called A Fiery Split, where an individual who I met in Dharamsala had a relative who immolated, and kind of piecing the story together to tell it kind of that way. The person in exile was trying to make sense of it, but really could only make sense of it through WeChat messages that they shared after the fact, and kind of gathering information in string from friends, trying to contextualize it for himself, the person in Dharamsala. Whereas the story for the person in India, or sorry, in Tibet, may have been very different. Not motivated by getting attention in the Washington Post at all, but motivated by just a desperation, a call for China to take a look at its policies. So, yeah, I mean that's how I looked. That's how I viewed it. How I looked at it. And I think that's still kind of the case. If not all, I'd have to look at all the numbers of the immolations have been outside of the TAR, in kind of on the border areas, and Ngaba is a place where Kirti Monastery is located, where it's been kind of an epicenter for these. And I was recently talking to somebody about the situation in Xinjiang, and the party secretary for Tibet has recently, in 2012, I think, became the party secretary for the Communist Party in Xinjiang. And he kind of made the point that, from the Chinese perspective, inside the Tibet Autonomous Region, the security blanket is absolute. And that's kind of what's being applied to Xinjiang as well. I mean, the authorities inside the TAR and all outside as well, but incredibly inside the TAR, we use kind of threats against family members. If your son or daughter or niece would dare self-immolate, well, you're going to pay the price. And so this adds a layer of discouragement, and it's worked. So the immolations have dramatically declined since their height. But as far as I know, again, I have to look at the numbers specifically, but inside the TAR, the blanket has always been, since 2008, incredibly thick. That's a good question. I don't have enough contemporary insight to be able to answer it, aside from the fact that the political side, he has really handed over the reins after 2012, I think it was, when he stepped down from the political leadership. And after the Tibetans elected, a prime minister, a Sikyong, which is the title, the kind of the negotiating side between the Tibetans and the attempts to negotiate with China have been handled by this elected office. The Dalai Lama, his approach, and the Karmapa's approach, and other senior Tibetan religious figures' approach has been dialogue with Chinese from a religious perspective, from a scientific perspective, not necessarily from a political standpoint. I don't know if the private office, the Dalai Lama's private office, is doing more than that. I could throw Kate Saunders under the bus here, a friend who would know if there's more to what's happening from the private office, but I'm not aware of more that's being done. Personally, I mean, there are many Tibetans who are frustrated by the separation, the political separation. There's been some writers who've criticized that decision by the Dalai Lama to step down his political leadership. Jamyang Norbu, who's a writer, has essentially said that decision threw the whole Tibetan issue under the bus and was kind of the final straw. It's one of the challenges, I think, for the Tibetan democratic process is that questioning decisions like that really don't happen that often in public. So it makes it complicated to fully have a sense what Tibetans think of these decisions that their leadership is making. But what I see from the political side, from the Sikyong's office, is commitment to renegotiating, but really a plea for help, public pleas to the EU and to the United States to kind of help them take the lead. But the Chinese have really shown no interest in continuing dialogue. That it's the direct connection between people that is really the main source of hope for Tibetans. So engaging directly with Chinese. If you've ever traveled to Dharamsala, you know, as I have over the years, more and more Chinese tourists are visiting the center of Tibetan exile. From the Tibetan perspective, that's very important because it continues this dialogue. I take a slightly, you know, more kind of politically pessimistic view because I think that, you know, the policy and the political conversation is not happening as much as it should or could, but there's no question that cultural engagement is strong. I mean, the Dalai Lama, as Kate said, he's 84, but he's you know, got a pretty thick itinerary. He travels all over the world, all the time, to continue. You know, I was in Rotterdam when he was there recently. You know, in the stadium of, you know, 15,000 people, just packed to listen to him talk. I mean, he is still this superpower, you know, this global icon for the Tibetan struggle and question and issue. But again, that feeds into my kind of after the Dalai Lama question. So for me, I've kind of tried to focus the question on that. Because I think that's a question that Tibetans need to ask now. I think, so we're starting, you start to see, you know, some of these policies that I mentioned, the Reciprocity Act that the House in the United States just passed, which essentially says if you don't allow people to visit Tibet, journalists and academics and scholars, then we will sanction your officials who are making these decisions. That now needs to move to the Senate, and then would need to be enacted into law. Questions as to whether or not that will happen. But these sorts of policies continue to be enacted. Does that change the fact that Apple is you know, heavily invested in China? I mean, I think there's a disconnect, but I don't know that that's not. I think that's how the world works, unfortunately. To say cut all economic ties with countries in a very heavily globalized world, well, that didn't work. That's what the 1990s were about. You know, that's what the message was, you know, back then. So if that's not the solution, or if it hasn't worked yet, maybe it's time to think about, you know, other avenues for change. You know, one of the things that I didn't write about in the book, but I did some research on through some academic work that I did at the London School of Economics, was looking at China's engagement in a project in India on rebuilding this institution called Nalanda, which is a historic foundational root of the Tibetan faith, Tibetan religion. And the Indians and the Chinese were working on this project together to rebuild this institution. That's changed a little bit, and because of internal issues, political issues inside of India, and I think there's less motivation now and enthusiasm. But at the time, when this kind of kicked off a number of years ago, it seemed like this might be an avenue for kind of mutual accommodation for something that was foundational to the Tibetan religious question that both India and China were working on. Are there other examples or other avenues for these sorts of kind of mutually beneficial projects to continue to open up new avenues? That's a question I think that is worth exploring even more broadly. So while governments in the United States and Europe you know, issue directives and pass legislation, and businesses continue to make their investments, that's happening. But are there other places to explore? I think is where we should be thinking. Yeah, sure.
This conflict that's going on in Tibet. Could it been triggered off ages and ages ago, sometime in history? Because I don't know much about the history of Tibet.
Yeah.
Something they did or whatever.
Yeah.
Could have triggered off this reaction. I don't know.
I'm not going to say that's not a possibility, because I certainly don't know enough I don't have the religious or academic background to dispute it. I will.
Look into it.
I can look into it. I will look into it. I would simply just say that almost suggests that. I mean, it almost seems to say that they had it coming.
I don't know.
Yeah,
every
but
action has a reaction. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
I'm just wondering whether.
Well, I mean,
Ignorance.
no, but I mean, all I can say from an early history that, you know, that there's this kind of big conversation dispute about whether Tibet was an independent country and whether it was not, and the Chinese and the Tibetans disagree on this point back and forth, and depending on how you read history, you know, no, I know. The relationship between the Tibetan state and the state never really existed as a state per se, but the relationship between Tibetan Buddhist schools and the imperial Chinese state was one for many centuries of kind of communal and shared patronage. The Tibetan lamas would provide religious support and you know, religious services, if you will, to the emperor, and there were kind of this priest patronage relationship for centuries. In modern contemporary time, really only after the fall of the Chinese Empire and 1949, when the modern Chinese state was created, that kind of 30-40 year period was when Tibet had kind of de facto independence as a modern state. To answer your question whether or not there was a karmic reaction to something, I certainly am not qualified to speak to that, but worth exploring. Yeah.
You probably need to ask a Tibetan lama.
Yeah.
As far as I know,
That's why.
Greg is not a reincarnated.
It's definitely not. The seat here made me nervous because it actually looks like a throne that you'd sit on. It's the haircut. Yeah.